Coda Educate. So this is a first of our Coda Educate sessions. Natalie's going to just open with a bit of an acknowledgement of country, and then I'm going to run through the background of Coda Educate and thank some of our supporters.
The traditional owners of the land upon which we stand, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. And wherever you are in the world, we ask that you just take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land upon which you stand. Welcome to Coda Zero.
So thanks, Nat. So we're really proud to collaborate with Philips, who are supporting this educational event. Philips aims to offer access to world-class healthcare education in order to enhance performance of healthcare professionals and improve patient outcomes. This premise is really, I guess, the core of the Educate pillar for Coda. We've carried the medium is the message concept forward from SMAC, and we're really wanting to facilitate open access to high quality education and also tackle topics that are really pertinent to our community and driven by community feedback. So without further ado, welcome to Coda Zero Educate session. Really excited to have you on board and hoping to go away with some really good prototypes for change.
I think that sounds like a good point to go on to our next guest, Meg. Welcome. Meg's joining me today. She was Wiradjuri through her father's family, as a sister to Minabar Aboriginal Health Promotion Organisation, and has a long history of research, advocacy and program delivery about the health and well-being of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who've been or are in the criminal justice system. Meg, we've been talking a lot about knowledge and information, but what does knowledge mean to you?
Well, so much of what Martin talked about, I'd love to try replacing AI with Indigenous knowledges, and so much of what he talked about resonated with me. Even though we might think that Indigenous peoples, we might associate with nature, and we don't associate AI with nature. But Martin talked about patterning and also that deep learning and connected learning and relationships, and these are all things that are fundamental to knowledge and to learning from Indigenous perspective. And I think too the real need to understand who our Indigenous peoples are, and in Australia Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and actually that maybe we are part of the future of AI globally, because half our population is young. A third are 15 or under. Our median age in Australia is 23 compared to 37 or 38 for the mainstream population. So what that means is we have an incredible opportunity to draw our young people in to technologies, but also for prevention. And so both of those things, need great discussion, and I hope to touch on a couple of points about each. But so really, when you think about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, think about us as teenagers, as a population. We are not an ageing population. We are probably not technically a youthing population, but that's an easy way to think about it. We're a population that's young, and really it's teenagers. And when we think about designing systems, whether that's education, whether that's healthcare, detection, treatment, support, we would design systems very differently from an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspective compared to the mainstream Australian or Western perspective. So part of that, as Martin's talking about too, is getting people together as collectives to understand data. One of my passions is using duggar weibull, which is a Wiradjuri word meaning holy and coming together. And we don't usually associate big data and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Time after time, I've been a researcher for 20 years, highly trained in Western sciences, quant and qual and Indigenous knowledges, but time after time is the expectation that I do storytelling, or that as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, we just like to do the qualitative work. And maybe it's the qualitative work that leads up to the quantitative work, or the qualitative work that gets added on after because we realise that the big data that we've got doesn't speak to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander demographic and that there's big gaps in our understanding. You know, actually that's offensive, and it overlooks the fact that as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander researchers, we are highly trained in both worlds or multiple worldviews, and that our knowledges and ways of understanding are actually highly complex because of that, partly because we walk in multiple worlds as well. You know, I identify as someone who's from three separate families who do not talk to each other or cross over. I know which family maybe I probably shouldn't say out aloud that I prefer because of some of the ways that family is, and that's the Aboriginal family, where our perspective on the world is, we're trained as Wiradjuri that our perspective on the world is across 7 generations. I have worked as an educator also for about 20 years. I have put a fine-tooth comb through all of the medical curriculum, psychology, physio, pharmacy, orthoptics, and nursing curriculum as well. And I know that our ways of viewing the world are not represented in that curriculum. So medical graduates can come out of med school with, you know, there's been some great developments through the leaders in Indigenous medical education, but where the rubber hits the road is at university. If universities don't meet their Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander staff targets, which they never do, and don't meet student targets, how do we get Indigenous knowledges into the curriculum? I fully support people of all cultures embracing Indigenous knowledges, and if you're there with your hands-on curriculum at universities, by all means do all you can, and don't think that you don't have a role with Indigenous peoples, because you do. We're a minority population, 3.3% in Australia. We don't have the hands-on deck to be of influence across all of that health curriculum to get our knowledges in there. So we have to work in partnership. I ask you, have you done all you can to become more familiar with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures, especially in your local area? And what about the curriculum in your area as well? And to really try to embrace that. So part of that is healing the fear that I think non-Indigenous people feel about Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people, about me. It is my daily experience that someone is a bit afraid of me, or they're sorry they might have offended me, or they're sorry they didn't know how to do a process. And so much of what I provide, I call it working backwards. I work backwards over other people's work for about half of my work week, contributing and telling other people how to access information about Indigenous knowledges or Indigenous health or protocols, and it's all in the public domain, I tell you. So partly I feel like my talents are being wasted, but I also try to have a little bit of humility, I suppose, that, you know, as Wiradjuri, I am someone who is a symbol of survival of massacres and child removal. Northeast Wiradjuri country, just when you come down from the Blue Mountains to Lithgow and country opens out wide. That is the start of these incredible lands that, you know, the colonisers saw as rich, fertile lands for crops and grazing. And our people were almost wiped out. So I'm extremely proud that I, you know, am one of those people who signifies survival. But I want to be more than that. And we have such low expectations of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. You know, I've combed through the federal budget in the last couple of days, and the allocations are poor, they don't meet need, and they're so uninspiring as well. So back to, you know, Indigenous knowledges in health, and I said we picture ourselves across 7 generations. I know the 5 generations I belong to, but we see that health is holistic. And if that doesn't have something to offer society, what does? which human doesn't need to include spirit, mental, physical, emotional, and social dimensions to their healthcare? You know, I don't think that that's just Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but that's a knowledge from our way that could be highly influential, and especially if we can be in among AI as it develops. We know Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are high uptakers and early uptakers of new technologies. And of course, because, you know, a lot of people are young, but also I think because our families are spread around regional, urban and remote environments, and we do move between those, technologies are a way that we connect too. So I think there's, you know, some great questions we could ask in health about the use of technologies. But that also means providing access to those technologies and keeping them up to date. But also back to healthcare providers, you know, I often talk about giving myself a software update. And that means to keep on learning. And there's ways, you know, that healthcare providers can keep on learning and have that lifelong journey, particularly about cultural competence and, you know, moving to new areas or say moving from one town to another. Give yourself that software update so that you do have that perspective of the local Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and knowledges, because they just differ so incredibly around Australia. If you don't have a copy of that map with all of our nations, that beautiful patchwork quilt that signifies all of our nations across Australia, you know, do yourself a favour and get that, because it will warp your mind. You want to go and try and find Rockhampton on that map or Canberra on that map, good luck, because the borders that we know of Queensland and New South Wales aren't easy to read on it. And it just shows you instantly how differently a worldview Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have of this country. You know, and I think that country, it is preeminent. It is the be-all and end-all for us. And, you know, we were taught as a young age to picture ourselves as humans, as like tiny ants on a mother's body, and to keep ourselves in that right size, and that there's the humility that flows from that. So, yeah, I think that we often don't bring that spirit to our healthcare either. You know, we're taught to separate out our personal from our professional and organisational dimensions of our frame of reference. But in Aboriginal ways, no way. You cannot and you must never separate out your person and your being from your practice. You must do all you can to understand it, to bring it into your practice, but to have ways of reflexivity, critical self-reflection, so that you know the implications of self on practice. It's a fundamental difference between Western health and Indigenous health, and you know, as is working in collectives. So that duggar weibull, that process of coming together as a collective and looking at big data sets with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander family and community members, it yields different outcomes, different understandings that the, say, Western trained epidemiologists might write and describe from, you know, a table of outputs and data. We look at that data and we will interpret something different from it, and we will automatically put it through the matrix of that holistic health and be identifying social determinants of health too. So all it takes is creating that safe space to bring people together. It's not hard, but it comes back to people being terrified of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians, me included, and I think I'm quite sweet.
You've been very nice this morning, certainly. I'll definitely give you that. And I think you've keyed into one of the challenges that Martin was really highlighting there, in that this move towards integrating technology is making us realise how non-holistic healthcare has been. We've had that traditional positivist approach to the way that we teach and the way that we practice healthcare, that something can be proven or disproven. how, I mean, we talked about how that clashes. How then can we take this forward? How can we coexist with your tens of thousands of years of knowledge dissemination? How can we use that for positive good for healthcare?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's some fantastic things to read. Sand Talk by Tyson Yunkaporta and Being Indigenous to the Universe by Kerry Arabina are two books that I recommend because in simple terms, in my small mind, it warps your mind. It triggers so much thought about different perspectives, different interpretations, words with different meanings and different uses. So really worth literally that food for thought. And if AI can't help us in understanding holistic health, then I'm really not sure what is, but it means that we need to put that concerted effort into having Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people or Indigenous peoples collaborating on some of those models. And, you know, we have our own models of healthcare, those real critical conversations about how they might intersect or speak to each other, how technology could serve our models of healthcare, even though they're more like frameworks and they're not data models that Martin's talking about, but why couldn't they be? So we just, you know, really haven't put the time or effort in, partly to building the relationships and the trust, partly because of that assumption that we're storytellers. But I reckon, you know, I often think about time series or cases, and say Wiradjuri, we're confident about 6,000 years of our history. Say there was one story a year for 6,000 years, that's 6,000 cases. Or say there were 4 stories a year, etc., etc. We start to think about, those are big data sets. Yes, they're different to big data sets, you know, that end up in Martin's computer. But I think that that's how Indigenous knowledges work, is that they accumulate over time because of continuous quality improvement and reflection. And just because they're spread over time, we mustn't think that those processes that we so highly honour in positivist worldviews didn't occur. But it's part of the low expectation of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people that colonisation has deliberately sold us as Australians, that the media reinforces in a really disgusting way, that even the budget reinforces that we're not worth it. We're a problem that need you good white people and your big algorithms to solve and detect and to treat, rather than involve at the beginning. I just think, like Bruce Pascoe says in The First Australians, we defy our own intelligence if we don't bring Indigenous knowledges into the picture, because to survive as cultures for 65,000 years or more, 6,000's enough for me in Wiradjuri terms, that's still, you know, an incredible amount of knowledges that are accessible about being holistic, thinking intergenerationally, and understanding how to be in relationships so that we can understand issues in a deep way. You know, like Bruce Pascoe says, we defy our own intelligence and do all you can to develop relationships with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders and young people to have us at the beginning of journeys and never added on, but at the beginning and throughout journeys, definitely.
Thank you, Meg. Jessie, do we have any audience questions we can bring to Meg?
A couple, I think they've really kind of been addressed, and an overwhelming kind of idea of slowing down to actually get more accurate rather than just trying to speed up, which seems to be the attention economy and the knowledge industry of now, is to speed up and do everything faster because we need answers quicker. So the trade-off with accuracy. So that's more a comment that I've seen on Twitter and in the section there. I guess the thing that's really come out powerfully is around connection. And given you mentioned, Meg, that there is, I guess, an inherent fear of misstepping, fear of doing the wrong thing that a lot of non-Indigenous people have. What are some tips for an organisational approach to actually getting this right? So how do you actually ingrain this, and who are some, I guess, who are some people that you would suggest reaching out to in Australia, and I guess opening that up on Twitter for those international audience here to share your experiences with who you'd reach out to in your areas?
You know, Twitter's a great platform. I think recently some lists went around about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to follow on Twitter. There's the hashtag BlackFellaTwitter as well, so you can see our real commentary about Australian society there. And Instagram has lots of accounts to follow with simple pictures with lists of 10 books to read, 10 films to see, or 10 places to go. These are things that, you know, don't leave it up to it being a workplace action that you engage with the First Peoples of this country. And don't leave it up to it being an HR issue, but because you want to, because you respect that maybe there's something about us after all that could be beneficial or could be leading edge, in fact, because we're courageous. We deal with multi-morbidity, compounding grief, poverty, but the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people I know do it with, yes, rage and anger. I feel rage and anger every single day, and it's always part of, you know, in my guts. But we are taught by elders to be humbled because country is bigger than us and everything we do must serve country. So there's always that ego check, I think, you know, among Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And I think we are called a spiritual people and a peaceful people. And we know that our future depends on our unity with everyone else in this country. That's why it's part of everyone's citizenship and being on country. There's not one place in this country that's not country. You know, it's not just the Northern Territory where 29% of the population's Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander. The biggest numbers are in Sydney and the Central Coast and the Gold Coast. And many of them are undercover and look a bit like me, so you never really can tell at a glance. So, you know, there's all kinds of assumptions to check about us. That's why working locally, understanding locally, the language names of place is so transformative in one's brain. So try to find out what the names were of the roads. All this information's in the public domain of rivers. And if you do want to enact something in the workplace, you know, I'm from the National Centre for Cultural Competence, and we do offer workshops on online learning. Online learning is, you know, it's opened up a real world to us, and I'd love to embrace new technologies within that, including that sort of weird bow that I want to draw to virtual reality from AI. But some of my own powerful learning experiences have been through virtual reality. And one through the Windsor Film Festival just last year that was held here in Sydney. It meant putting on a headset, but as soon as I had that headset on, I was transported to an Aboriginal community that I did know nothing about, nor their culture or language. And the user of VR was inside a funeral pole, which we don't have in Wiradjuri. So to be within this wooden log and hearing and seeing ceremony through a crack in the wooden log, but then the VR story was actually about grief and the separation that of social isolation. So it wasn't just about being at a funeral, but the story was so layered and complex that it told a story of a man's poor mental health and how isolated he was. And then we watched as people from the community reached out and took him through ceremony to connect back to his identity and country and a plan for his health and well-being. All of that within a couple of minutes of VR. So, you know, that's real transformative education, and it's about embracing technologies within that in the future for cultural competence and cultural safety, agricultural safety frameworks are essential. Get on to developing one of those within your workplace collaboratively. Make partnerships, have morning teas and meet and greets to make those partnerships with local community members. But underneath that, we've got to be able to answer, what do I have to offer? Not just what do we need, but to work reciprocally to understand, how can I be a good partner to someone else? So it's all circular to come back to self, and a strong sense of self within that, and addressing that fear. Yeah, so, but a beautiful world. I absolutely encourage people, because you never go back once you've seen the world from, you know, black fella perspective, then you just are enriched so much.